Hey there, it's Gary Shuster, your friendly neighborhood inventor, and welcome to another episode of the Innovation Café. Um, Today we're going to talk about something that's super important for everyone, but for inventors in particular, the imposter superpower. Now, I know most people know it as the imposter syndrome, and I get that because it's been around since the 1970s and people have been talking about it. But in the context of innovation, and really in the context of most things, it's much more of a superpower than it is anything else. So, what should inventors think about the imposter syndrome? Well, let's find out. Um, let's turn to some of our favorite inventors. Here we go with Albert Einstein. Now, this guy, well-known innovator, right? Was once known to call himself an involuntary swindler because of the high esteem in which his work was held. There's a reason for that. That probably didn't help that after finishing school, he could not get a job teaching physics, which is what he really wanted to do. So he ended up working at the patent office, which is a fine choice. As you'll learn from watching this channel, I love patents. I think that they're a fantastic way to protect inventions. But he spent, he got hired there as a technical expert third class, which is a little bit weird to think about Albert Einstein as third class technical expert. It took him 4 years to get promoted to technical expert second class. So he probably was walking away from that job at the patent office feeling a little bit like an imposter. But his lack of any formal career success, of any formal, detailed formal training, is probably what led him to his groundbreaking theories. You don't need to have all those internalized things that can't be accomplished. So let's look to Maya Angelou, fantastic author, trailblazing, and yet she thinks people are going to figure her out one day, that she's run a game on everyone, and she's not really worth what people think she is as an author. I mean, how can she think of herself still as an imposter after reaching that level of success? Well, that's what happens when you make a living with your mind. When all that you got really is your brain power, and that's what you're making a living on. It's not like you can test it. You can't. Yes, there are tests, but they don't really test creativity. It's not like going to the gym and how much can I bench press, and so I'm going to be really good at doing this form of construction that involves this level of lifting. This is intellectual stuff, and we all have a lot of self-doubt. Now, Tina Fey may have probably did, actually. See, it's Innovation Café, so here we go with the coffee. Tina Fey kind of nailed it. She says the beauty of the imposter syndrome is that you vacillate between extreme egomania and a complete feeling of, I am a fraud, oh my God, they're onto me. Now, if you have never felt that, you're probably not doing it right. You should be able to innovate in areas that you're not really expert in and feel like a complete fraud, and yet keep on going, because that's really the key to innovation. So let's take a look at Sheryl Sandberg. She's also fairly well known, at least in the tech community, as the number 2 person at Facebook. And she'd been there for a very long time, and yet there are still days when she wakes up and thinks, "Oh my God, what am I doing here? I'm a fraud." So it's pretty well established. Successful people don't always feel like they deserve their level of success. You start to ask these questions. What am I doing here? I'm not that creative. How did I come up with that? I must have stolen it somehow that I don't remember doing. Did I just scam everyone into believing in me? Have I run a game on the patent office somehow and they think that I know what I'm doing? They're going to find me out, man. I am going to be found out. So you're not alone. If you're feeling this, you are definitely not alone. Okay? And this affects really everyone who is creative, and it absolutely affects creators. Now, when you think about it, if you screw something up in your job, you're waiting for the world to end. But you shouldn't be, because Thomas Edison nailed it. Thomas Edison famously said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." Of course, that's what progress is. Progress is trying over and over and over and over to come up with a thing, and then finally it happens for you. It's not rocket science. It's not even brain surgery. It's pretty straightforward stuff. If you don't fail, you can never succeed. So how can you fail that many times and not have a mountain of self-doubt? You can't, really. So if you're doing it right, if you're being creative and you're approaching it in the right way, this is sort of the same thing as when you do brainstorming sessions and you say, okay, let's start out with this idea. There's no bad ideas. Let's just go over everything and we'll figure out later what we'll stick with. I mean, this is the innovation version of that. You're going to get it wrong, and you should get it wrong a bunch of times, because if you get it right the first time, well, life would be no fun, would it? There's a lot to the challenge. You need to know enough to understand what is possible, but not so much that you have internalized what other people think is impossible. So your professors at university, well, we can't do that. We've tried many times for decades to do this thing, and, it can't be done. Well, no, it can't be done yet. Can't be done with current technology. Don't internalize that stuff. If you're in a graduate program, take all the advice on here's what we've discovered, here's how things work, and take with an enormous ocean filled with salt, not just a grain of salt, the idea that there are things that are impossible, because it's just impossible for now. So now, before we head on, let me talk a little bit about a really, really important subject, and that is neurodiversity. Okay? Neurodiversity is what supercharges innovation. And a corollary to that is there really is no such thing as neurotypical. And, if you think that there is, I get it, this is how science tends to function, but really rethink it a little bit. I mean, I get why people come to think that there is a neurotypical, but there isn't. Neurodiversity is a superpower. Okay, now think about it. If everyone thought about everything the same way, would we create anything new? Would there be anything new on Earth? No. This is what I hope Apple was describing in its advertising campaign, Think Different. I mean, literally think different, and people who are neurodiverse literally do think different. And it's important to look at it as another superpower. It's an amazing thing. So let's look at some people with neurodiverse traits. Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein. There are plenty of people, plenty of innovators who are what psychologists would think of as neurodiverse. So Nikola Tesla was thought to have OCD. He probably had a better level of focus on a lot of his tasks. ADHD it's like the inventor's identification badge almost. I mean, you have Thomas Edison, who did okay as an inventor, Larry Page of Google, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Graham Bell, Wilbur Wright, Galileo, Bill Gates, and again, Nikola Tesla, and so many others. The ability to skip from subject to subject to subject in your head allows you to connect things that people who have really linear thinking don't connect. And that's the critical, that's the secret sauce of innovation, is wow, if you take these four things from these four totally different areas and combine them, you get something amazing. So, don't feel like it's holding you back. It's pushing you forward. And yeah, you still need to deal with the side effects of it. And those of us with ADHD have figured out, how to live a successful life, most of us anyhow, with it. Another trait, which is tied a lot with innovation, is one that Albert Einstein, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, and others are thought to have, which is autism spectrum. And that's, I think, much more of a profound difference to how your brain processes information, which means that you have a more profound set of superpowers. That, if you're the only one who thinks in this lane over here and everyone else is thinking in these lanes, well, if the invention happens to be in this lane, you're the one who's going to discover it. So I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to embrace neurodiversity and to just leave in the dustbin of history this idea that there should be some neurotypical, it's in the same way that there's not a perfect male body or a perfect female body. There's not a perfect human brain. Every human brain has its own good parts and bad parts and mediocre parts, and that's, I think, what we really need to focus on. Let's look at the imposter syndrome as a superpower, because that's really the subject of today's talk. When you feel like an imposter, what does that mean? What's that a sign of? Well, it's a sign, for one, that you're pushing some boundaries, right? Imposters push boundaries. And, you're in an unexplored area, so there's no validation that you're going to find. There's a rogues gallery of fakers. And let's just go through some of them really quickly. There's Harvard dropout and well-known intellectual buffoon Mark Zuckerberg. No, none of those things other than the Harvard dropout are true. He didn't know that it was impossible, and it was impossible at the time, to manage the amount of data that Facebook and the other meta entities have with a database. He couldn't do it. But no one told him that, and he didn't stay at Harvard long enough to have it hammered into his head that, no, man, that's impossible. Don't even think about it. So he did. He thought about it and figured it out and solved it. Rogue number 2, Steve Jobs. Dropped out of Reed College, didn't even have a degree in design. How was he ever going to succeed at anything? Well, because no one told him that certain things couldn't be done. And even when things were known to not be doable, he would try to do them. Sometimes you'd have him develop technology, and it's like, well, we're going to have to figure out once storage density gets to this place, or battery energy density gets to that place, or bandwidth over cellular networks gets here, then we'll roll out the invention. So, he even would invent for things that were still to come. Some of the technology hadn't arrived there, but he could see it coming. No one told him he couldn't do it. And even when someone did tell him that's not possible, he would just say, it's not possible yet. Just wait around, you'll see. Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard. Elon Musk made it all the way through one full day at Stanford and dropped out on day 2. And these people are not failures by any stroke of the imagination. Richard Branson dropped out of high school. Jack Dorsey, who founded Twitter, NYU dropout. Walt Disney dropped out of high school. Michael Dell dropped out of University of Texas, Austin. Henry Ford dropped out at 15 years old. Thomas Edison had him beat, though, because he dropped out of school at 12 years old. So what do these people have in common other than wild runaway success and a seeming inability to sit in a classroom? Well, we can speculate what drove them all to drop out and then later succeed wildly, but I know one of those things, and that is they weren't taught they can't do it. They were taught, well, here's some things that could be done. Some of them were. Even Thomas Edison didn't even get to that part at 12 years old. They were barely covering, algebra. But they weren't taught limits. And that's the key. Limits are just what people currently think can't be done. Too much expertise makes you think too many things are impossible. Expertise can be the enemy of innovation. Now, there's really two kinds of inventions. The first one is incremental inventions. So, think about, we were able to jam another 5% more storage onto a magnetic hard drive, that kind of thing. And that requires a lot of education and expertise. But then there are these sort of big picture inventions. And with a big picture invention, you can think of regenerative braking, where, it's the key to making electric cars workable is instead of just burning all the energy in your momentum out in the brakes, it actually runs the motor backwards and generates electricity. That kind of big idea. The big idea of being able to take a communications call and go from tower to tower to tower so that you can be moving, that's a big idea. And then you need people for the smaller portions of that, like, okay, well, how do we technically handle the network handoff, and how do we send packets to the correct place? Things like that. But the big picture stuff, and these are all the rogues gallery, is all big picture people. The imposter is a creator because they don't know what's supposed to stop them. Right? If you don't recognize that you can't do it, then you're going to try to do it, and that's what they did. So let's turn to maybe my favorite imposter of all time, Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr was the most promising new actress of 1939, starred in 30 feature films, no science background whatsoever. So what did she accomplish? She had no real education other than some acting classes. So what did she accomplish? The big thing she's remembered for is something called frequency hopping. And that is critical to early cell networks. It really is what makes possible almost all modern telecommunications. She developed this as a way to prevent jamming of Allied torpedoes during World War II. And it took, like many things, she probably felt like a huge imposter coming up with that, because it took well over a decade for that technology to get the attention of the U.S. military. And it might not have helped, but it does illustrate the point really well, that her co-inventor on that was a composer with no formal science training. So again, it's this big picture invention of, well, what if we go from one frequency to another? She also invented a self-carbonating soft drink, which didn't quite taste good, and so that didn't succeed. It was a pill you dropped into a drink and it would self-carbonate. She invented improvements in traffic signaling, in aircraft. She was sort of a modern day Da Vinci, and no training. She was the ultimate imposter. Another imposter, the world's wealthiest man, adjusted for inflation, wealthiest human to ever walk the earth, John D. Rockefeller. His formal education, 10 weeks of bookkeeping classes. That's it. Then he went into bookkeeping for 4 years or so. Then he went into produce and food wholesaling. So far, it doesn't sound like the guy that's going to end up running the most enormous monopoly on energy ever conceived. He then eventually built a refinery. He got into construction, built a refinery that someone else owned. And after a few years, he decided, maybe it's time for me to mess around with refineries. So he purchased the refinery and eventually formed Standard Oil. And the rest is history. The guy, he's John D. Rockefeller. He was quite successful at it, and probably we can thank or curse him, depending on how you feel, for aggressive antitrust laws that got passed in the wake of that, and some steel monopolies. So now let's go to someone who you might not think is quite an imposter, but absolutely is. Okay, Jeff Bezos. He did have the background. you needed to succeed in the world of the internet. He had bachelor's degrees in electrical engineering and computer science. So that's pretty much, those are the big ones, right? Except for Amazon. It's not the big ones for Amazon. Amazon's real challenge was logistics. And no one told him. He had no background in logistics. He didn't know that you could ship, 1.6 million packages on an average day, 175 million products on a single day in 2019. I mean, that's a logistics nightmare. I mean, you got to get these goods, you have to either drop ship them or package them, and you have to get them shipped, and you have to have agreements with distributors, and it just seems an impossibility. And it was probably thought of as an impossibility before he, not knowing that he couldn't do it, did it. So there really is, I mean, he really is a prime example of someone who knew enough to know what was possible. He could do all the programming for it. He could start to take orders online, but he didn't really know what couldn't be done, which is the logistics part of it. And to give you an idea of how surprising it was that they were able to do this level of logistics, even Amazon was apparently surprised because they had installed in their headquarters a bell. And every time someone submitted an order, the bell would ring. And sometime between taking an order every few hours and taking 175 million product orders a day, they turned that bell off because it just became white noise and constant ringing. So it surprised even them. So let's reframe how we think about the imposter syndrome. It's the imposter superpower. Get used to calling it that and stop with the imposter syndrome stuff. Yeah, sometimes you need to explain to people what you're talking about. So yeah, I've got the imposter superpower. That's how I'm creative. You might know it as the imposter syndrome, but let me tell you why it's wrong. Right? That's the way you approach this thing. Listen to those feelings of being an imposter, because those are actually, surprisingly, probably a sign of growth. If you're feeling like, wow, I'm stepping out of my lane, I'm an imposter, I'm not trained in this, I'm, like Maya Angelou, I've been running a game and they're going to find me out. I'm an involuntary swindler because I'm off coming up with these physics theories that I have no business coming up with. Well, no, those are all legitimate things. And they're all signs that you're succeeding. So here's to you, fellow imposters, fellow creators, fellow inventors. Live your life as an imposter. It will never, never get old. You'll always be doing fun stuff.